Welcome to the inaugural episode of Big Little Pictures. I'm your host, Brad Willerton. I've always wanted to deliver to the people a podcast where I can sit down in front of a microphone, sometimes by myself, but preferably with a guest, to discuss film. But I've never wanted to focus on big blockbuster films or films that got the public's attention. I've always been a fan of smaller independent films that don't wow you with their special effects, heavy action, or gratuitous violence. I'm talking about films that wow you with their ability to tell a story, something that will stick with you long after the final frame has disappeared. On this first episode, I'm glad to announce that I have a very special guest with me, and I believe that the two films that we touch on today fall into the category that I've just described. So without further ado, let's get to talking about Big Little Pictures. I would like to introduce you, Nicole.
Heinrichs-Bideau. Yes.
All right. And you tell us a little about yourself
Sure.
and how we know each other, I guess.
Yes, of course. So Brad was one of my top students in my summer art of film course. I teach film studies and humanities at Century College. And all the film studies classes we have are also taught by Ruth Wollersheim. So we're the team of the Humanities and Film Studies Department. And we have 3 classes, art of film, American cinema, and international film. And then we have a couple of humanities courses. And it is a great joy to teach film studies and film literacy, media literacy, because of the time we live in. It's so pervasive in our lives. And I love bringing attention to observation in my students and helping them observe things and notice things they had never noticed before and become these critical viewers. Some of them come back to me and say, "You've ruined film watching for me forever." And I'm like, "Good. You mean you really feel it now. You really know where the meaning comes from."
Exactly.
And I came to it because I worked in the film industry. I went to film school actually in Paris. I lived in Paris, France for a long time, and then became the director of production for the Minnesota Film Board in Minnesota. And so I was a producer with Bill Polad's River Road Productions and was producing films and slowly began teaching and found out, oh, I love teaching. Just being around a diversity of students, diverse in many different ways, and hearing how they feel about films and helping them understand, and they often teach me as much about film as anything, hearing from them what they can see in a film and what they notice. So that's how we met, and I loved reading what you had to say about films, and you taught me things as well.
Well, I guess, yeah, that kind of... Your reason for teaching is a similar reason why I wanted to do a podcast like this. You know, I think when you love something enough, the next best thing is to share it with other people. So
Yeah.
sounds like was very fulfilling for you to take the joy that you'd had working in films or watching films and then not only just pass it on to others, but to hear other perspectives on film is, like you say, it can open up a new window in what it means to somebody else.
It makes our lives so much more interesting and enriched, right?
Yes. And I will agree, maybe not so much from the art of film class, but from my VCC classes with Adam and Mike Eddy, it's kind of ruined watching films to me in the sense that I can't, and again, there's still plenty of films where I can just sit back and not check out, but just relax and be entertained. But I definitely look at them in a different way, you know. My partner, she's tired of hearing about how great the lighting is in the scene and how much effort it must have taken to get the right lighting,
it's
which
real art.
I found out if you can get lighting right or, you know, scheduling right, those are 2 of the biggest hurdles to have to overcome.
Yeah, everything looks so seamless when we go to the movies. We don't realize how much effort and time has been put into it. And so when you see a masterpiece or something that you really feel, it's hard to know what it is. And that's where we come in, right, is we want to take apart how that worked. How did you create that feeling in somebody with that story?
Right. Yeah, I spent a good portion of my life just watching and sincerely enjoying movies, but never giving a second thought really to all that went into it, the collaboration that goes into it, and the beauty that comes out of that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real team effort.
Sure.
Well, I have tasked you, and you graciously accepted the challenge to watch not an easy movie to watch. At first, we, as you know, had originally discussed, well, let's watch all three of the foreign films from last year's Oscars, which were the three that really stood out to me the most. And through your film studies
too.
class that I took, I gained a little more appreciation for foreign films. I think I watched Timbuktu. Cleo from 5 to 7
Yes, you
was a
did.
wonderful movie, and Run Lola Run, which I had heard of being a child of the 90s. I remember that movie coming out, and I said, subtitles? No, there's no way I'm not sitting through this. And I'm glad I did, because it was a wonderful movie that played out in
Yeah.
3 different scenarios and
Yeah.
was very original in that sense.
Absolutely. Good. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. And, I ask my students, please try to watch at least one foreign film in this class. I give lots of options, right? So
Yep.
that my students are interested in something and they can go for it.
Mhm.
And so you watched almost exclusively foreign language films.
Yes.
That's
Mhm.
great.
I
love
did.
it.
Yeah, it was encouraging too. And I assumed most of my fellow students were younger than me. That's just likely.
Mm-hmm.
But it was cool to see what they gained from it, or what they gleaned from the film, and how engaged they
love
were
that.
into it too. It was actually a little surprising with some of the assumptions that us older people have about young people today, that they're only concerned with what's right in front of them on their phone, or don't have this ability to
Mhm.
grasp something
Mm-hmm.
bigger, which I most certainly was proved wrong, at least in this case.
Yes. I've had to get away from those assumptions as a professor. And people come at this from all different maturity levels, experience levels, all kinds of things. But I know that you also gave students something to think about in what you wrote in that class. That was super important.
Well, the feeling is mutual. There were some good students and some good perspectives on the movies. Um, well, I was a bit reticent just because of the subject matter, but of the 3 movies from last year that were foreign films, The Zone of Interest, Anatomy of a Fall,
Mhm.
and Past Lives, which
Mhm.
I loved all 3 of them.
Me too.
The one that seemed to have the most kind of ambiguity to it, where I didn't really know what to feel. The first time I saw it was in the theater, and I went, I don't know if I like this film or not. I don't know really what to think about it, but each time I've watched it, I've gained a little bit more perspective on it.
This is the zone of interest.
The Zone of Interest,
Mhm.
yes, which is, I guess, the film we'll be talking about first.
Okay.
Um, just a brief summary. It's set in Auschwitz, or just outside the walls of Auschwitz, and it follows the Commandant Rudolf Hess, as you know, and his wife Hedwig, and their 5 children, and kind of the mundanity of their lives,
Mhm.
and to show us how boring really it was,
Mhm.
We think of the perpetrators, of the Holocaust as monsters, which they clearly were.
Absolutely.
They were complicit regardless of how they pretend not to be.
Mhm.
Um, what were you've seen it once, so I'm
Saw it once.
curious to
Yeah.
see what your
I
initial
had
thoughts are.
already read a lot about it, so most of the time now I go into films having read a little bit about it. So I was ready for it. I also had in the past seen a lot of films on the Holocaust, including Shoah, which was the 9-hour documentary of interviews with Holocaust survivors, witnesses, and perpetrators.
Claude Lanzmann. Yep.
Yes, that's exactly right. And usually films about the Holocaust or any other enormous, massive human tragedy, focus on the violence and sensationalize that to a certain respect to create an emotional angst in the spectator. I mean, really what filmmakers are doing is portraying a story and trying to get the viewer involved in the story, right? And the way that Glazer does it is he does not glamorize the violence. He doesn't show it. So, in effect, what you're watching is not what dictates what you're watching. So, the actual subject matter is hidden. So, in that respect, there's no gratuity, there's no glamour, there's no sense, sort of, what's the word I was looking for? Sensationalizing the horror of the Holocaust and at Auschwitz. But you see the banality of evil, right? I mean, that sort of phrase is thrown around a lot with this film, the banality of evil. And it's so mundane, and the way that it's filmed, I also really think was smart in that the camera is still, you have these static wide shots of an environment, and you have this soundscape that washes over it. So you're realizing that what's happening on the other side of the wall in the concentration camp is barely affecting what is going on the other side of the wall, which looks like a kind of a Garden of Eden of sorts. And these people go about in their lives profiting off, and perfect little placement of how they're profiting off of death and cruelty, right? And so that soundscape that washes over the banality of the lives of these people is horrifying. And it's I want to say under the skin, which is another Glazer film, right? It goes right into you without creating that dopamine effect that a lot of action-packed horror films,
shock
that shock.
value.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're left to contemplate. You've got these sort of long takes, static film, and you have to contemplate and really listen to what the landscape or soundscape is. It makes you really meditate on what's going on complacency, and it always comes back to you. This is why I love slow films, and my students will say, "Can we watch something else?" But I think that slow films with long takes that are dealing with deep, complex, terrible subject matter like this bring it back to the viewer. You can still be in that space, but you're thinking about how you relate to it. Could I be complacent? How am I complacent? How am I complicit? The same as the Aftersun, which we're going to get into. It involves me as the spectator questioning my own world. And so I think that without the gratuitous violence that you see in so many other films, without that sort of gratuitous glamorization of the horror, it comes back to us more easily. You can't pass it off and say, oh, that was a piece of entertainment. You can say, oh, this is about something that's human, and I can think about myself in that context.
Absolutely.
So that's what struck me as I watched it. This sort of devastating, what's hidden is so horrific, and these people who are bombarded with it constantly, not the visual but the audio, it's so banal to them. And I didn't feel that in the film. I read that other people felt like, even the sound producer, what was his name?
Johnny Byrne or
yes,
Micah Lee?
Yes, Johnny. So I watched an interview of him talking about it and how he was editing and he went back into the middle of it first. And he said, oh, isn't this sound too loud? And he realized, no, it was just as loud as it ever was, but I toned it out, or I tuned it out as I was watching the film from the beginning. And it's an exact analogy or sort of metaphor to what these people were doing. They just tuned out the gunshots and the furnace belching and horrible screams.
Right.
They just tune it out over time. I didn't do that because as a film nut, I'm listening for it. I'm trying to figure out where all of the techniques are coming from.
Right.
So I don't know.
It's a very good answer. Like you, I oftentimes will, I can't help but read maybe a review or something about a film before. So I knew going in that sound was very, very important to this film. The director himself said that it's as important. It's almost like the second film is the sound, if not more important than what we see, is what we hear. When I first saw it, just the opening of the film was basically 5 minutes of darkness on the screen, which told me that get ready to listen because what you hear is going to be almost as important as what you see.
I love that you bring up the first part of the film because many filmmakers have said you just have to look at the first 5 minutes of a film and get an idea of what's going to be important to either look at or hear, listen for. And I love that you brought that up. What do you think about the music that's in that part that we hear at the end as well? And throughout, there are little bits of this atonal, guttural sort of sound. What did you take from that?
Oh, that's tough. It was it kind of droned, the music did, but you could hear whispers and hear little voices. So to what end the point of that was, I'm still not exactly sure.
Yeah.
Um,
I found it interesting because so much of the film tried to be natural or almost like a documentary in some respects. Like we were just watching this family from the sidelines. And a couple of the things like those little negative pieces of the girl who left the apples behind.
Yes.
And that sound, that guttural sort of almost Icelandic singing, that throat singing. Yeah, that's what it sounded like. I thought that is not realistic. What is that? Why did he choose to put that in the film? For what reason? Anyway, I was curious about that.
For sure. Yeah, the movie, it still kind of sticks with me. Like it's a virus almost, from the moment I left the theater, not knowing what to think about it, I knew I would see it again. I didn't know I'd be having a podcast about it at that time. I'm glad I watched it again though, because it's so, to analyze it, there's so many ways you could go. I mean, we can always look back and look online and read, well, what did the director mean here? And to a certain degree, they will give us hints or just straight up say, well, this is what it was, regarding the girl picking apples, that was Jonathan Glazer's. She was like the one source of light, is what he said. That was the one point in the movie, and he said every movie should have some source of good or light, which this movie had very few. But outside of the sound, I don't think we would have really known what we were watching, For quite a ways into the film. We're probably 10 minutes in before, unless you're very perceptive, we don't really know what we're watching,
Yes.
They look like a normal family, They have birthday parties. They go swimming in the river with human remains floating by. Yeah, it's just, there's so much symbolism too.
Yes.
I think,
Me too.
in the movie. I didn't really understand the lilac bushes. He talked about, to the guards, he sent out a memo. I didn't know, was he really that mad about lilac bushes? Does that mean that he, is he being childish because he just didn't get his transfer, or he was being forced to be transferred? Was it just a childish reaction for him? Was it to prove to us that he cares more about some bushes than he does about the thousands of people that he slaughters every day? And on a deeper level, I thought, do the flowers maybe tend to um, represent the prisoners or
Uh-huh.
the victims. Because there's one scene in the film where after Hedwig is carrying her baby around, showing her the
Yeah.
flowers, we just see close-ups of different flowers. And
Yes.
behind those close-ups, we hear screams and
Mhm.
cries of prisoners, only to, transition to a fully blood red screen, which kind of
Right.
sits there again, just like the opening where it was all black. Now it's all red. I
Brilliant.
guess the reason I think maybe that could be, and maybe it's open to interpretation for each viewer, what it means, but we also see a gardener fertilizing
Yeah.
plants with what we can only assume is human remains. These ashes, these flowers were grown sadly from the remains of.
Exactly. That is a perfect description of what the flowers and the garden.
If that's what he meant, I think he's brilliant. Maybe I'm digging too
Yeah,
deep
no.
into it, but it doesn't really matter. I guess it's what we
Exactly.
take from it. Um,
I think that's a wonderful analysis.
that was one of the things that kind of like, well, what does this mean? Why is this,
Yes.
with mise en scene, that's
Yeah.
more visual, but as far as like everything is on the screen for a reason. Nothing happens by accident. So
Right.
why show us this? Why are the lilac bushes important? He has an encounter later in the film where a woman comes into his office,
Mhm.
seemingly, without Hedwig's knowledge. This is
Mhm.
private as he, retires to a tunnel downstairs to clean himself after, I would guess, he violates or, abuses this woman. Another analogy I read was, is that what the flowers represent when he said, don't disturb the flowers so much that others can't enjoy them later?
Oh,
Was he talking to the guards about, if you're going to violate these women, don't do it so explicitly or fiercely that it's unenjoyable, or which again is maybe even too dark to want to contemplate, but
Mhm.
I guess just a few
Wow.
things that I took from it.
That scene, I couldn't stop thinking about because of when and how it was filmed. When in the film it occurred, he was talking on the phone, talking about the lilac bushes, and he was talking about how to prune them. Don't cut them back so much, right? So that they continue to, some of them can grow.
Right.
Which ones do you leave behind? Which ones do you cut off? I was looking at it in that sort
Mhm.
of metaphor of what he gets to choose. And he's giving orders on how to choose, how to prune.
Mhm.
And it was these orders. Everything is so orderly, right? And the woman who comes in has this long hair. She takes off her shoes. She's a wispy woman. She doesn't look like the other women in the family who are robust and strong. And she puts her hair down and waves it around. And I thought, this is so amazing because the mise en scène is showing us everything. And it took our observation of the portrayal of women and how the men acted around them throughout the whole film until we get here. This is about, is it 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the
Yeah, at
film?
least,
It's
yeah.
toward the end.
Yep.
And then his walking through all of these tunnels that you can only imagine. And I read later that these are the real tunnels of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I believe so, because
Oh.
I believe a good deal of the film was filmed on site. Now, the actual house that the Hess family lived in was not used. There was a house nearby
Yes.
within like 100 yards, similar, that they recreated to look exactly like it.
Mhm.
Which, if you've actually seen the Hess household, which coincidentally just this past weekend, HBO released something called The Commandant's Shadow,
Oh.
and it's all about Rudolf Hess.
Wow.
And it actually focuses on his son Hans, who was portrayed in the movie, who is now in his mid to late 80s, who has acknowledged his father's crimes, but is somewhat, I think, he's kind of buried a lot of that, in his subconscious, because the father he knew was a loving father and was there, and children, and they didn't really see anything. They heard things, they didn't see what was happening, although there was one point in the movie where I think it was Hans's character, the younger boy, who did hear gunshots or hear commotion outside of his window, and you could hear, I knew because I had the subtitles on, it said, Commandant. He instructed one of his guards to drown him in the river.
Yes, I remember
And
that
Hans
scene
kinda
so
walked
well.
away.
That was Hans. I couldn't remember
Yes.
which of the boys was Hans.
So there was actual footage from that film, of the household, and it was eerily similar to what Jonathan Glazer and his set designers, portrayed in the film.
But going back to those tunnels, because
Yes, so they were, I would believe they
Why?
were on Auschwitz.
so I ask myself that, because that was a very powerful sequence, and I ask myself, how did Glazer decide that after this encounter, which already was crazy to me, that you could tell who this woman was right away, right? And how he was talking, how he was standing, how she was sitting. And then he walks down these two tunnels, and it's long, and you watch him coming towards you. You don't watch him going away, he's coming towards you. And then he's in this cavernous basement space, like a cellar, washing himself. It was just,
Yeah.
why show that?
They say nothing, but it's very vile,
It's vile.
if you are paying attention to what just happened. Because so much of the movie has him looking like a good family man, but there's always these little reminders that he's not a good person.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, I could probably go on for another hour about this movie. Another scene, I guess we can kind of jump towards the end of the movie. Another scene that kind of tripped me up and had me trying to analyze or overanalyze, my girlfriend and I, when we talked about it, was after the party, after he had talked to Hedwig, when he was in Berlin, where they had this extravagant party for his new vision on how to create an even better extermination camp,
Yes.
And he talked to his wife afterwards. He dreamt about how he would gas the entire room,
Yes.
Was he having remorseful, was he...
It felt like
What's the
power.
word?
It felt like I don't know, but to me it felt like a sense of total control and power at that point. And then the sound goes off, and you
Yeah.
hear different sounds as you watch him look over the party,
Mhm.
right? But did you feel that he was having remorse? Because he does vomit, right? Pretty soon after that.
He nearly vomits, yes.
Okay, nearly.
He nearly
Not quite.
vomits. He retches.
He
and-
retches, that's right. God.
Yeah. So that's really the part where I thought, well, when he goes down the steps, he retches and gags as if he's going to throw up.
Yes.
And it's followed immediately as he looks down a hallway, we think maybe to the future.
Yeah.
And down that hallway, our next scene is of the current day Auschwitz, the
How it's
museum.
turned into a museum.
Somewhere I read that, was he actually sick? Was he remorseful? Or was he more angry that in his vision of the future, he wasn't a hero? He was really on the wrong side of history. He was
Evil.
a footnote in what is, arguably the largest calamity in the history of mankind.
Right.
Or was it remorse? That's, I guess, for us to decide. I don't know.
Yeah, and a lot of people feel uncomfortable with that ambiguity, but I think that part of Glazer's intent is to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Which the whole movie had me uncomfortable.
Right? So we don't really know, and we might all have a different interpretation But in the end, we're not sure. And I think that, again, it comes back to us, how, how unsure or uncertain we are in our own contexts. I don't know, that ambiguity comes back to us. It doesn't say on the screen. So you walk away with that.
Yeah, we take it with us, which I definitely have. In each time I've watched it, it's I still am left with
Yeah.
what does it all mean? Or to what point? Especially now, when I first saw trailers and reviews, they said this is so relevant in our times right now. This movie,
Yes.
are we to think that a lot of rhetoric, and I'm not going to get political, but or try not to, but there's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of division. There's
Yeah.
a lot of the word fascism is thrown around
Yep.
quite you know
Liberally.
liberally
Yep.
nowadays. The word Nazism is thrown around
Yep.
quite liberally.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe is it Glazer's point that we're this close to maybe something like this happening again, or a person like this does exist on Earth right now. It's our job to keep them at bay, or there's
Absolutely.
always going to be, you know, somebody out there evil, or, uh, is it somebody that's just feels like I'm just doing my job? Rudolph Hess,
Absolutely.
when I've read, what I've read of him since watching the film was he just said, well, I'm just doing my job and I'm doing it
Right.
as best I can. Um, Although other accounts, psychologists that talked to him said there's too much apathy in his demeanor to indicate any kind of remorse,
Mm.
which we don't think there is, which back
It's
to the scene,
devastating.
back to the end scene where after he retches, after we see the current museum, he then continues on. When
Yeah.
we come back to him, at first I thought that was just a, a, a second way to show it. Well, the
Mm-hmm.
first time he goes down the steps, he retches. The second time he walks on with,
Mm.
no problem.
No problem.
But I realized, I think it's just, it's a flight of steps. So he retches, he gets ill from it, yet he still continues on into the
Mhm.
darkness
Yes.
and seeing, take with it, from it
Yes.
what you will.
Yes. And he's going down those.
Yes, and this, he did, this happened in 1943, 2 years before, it all ended. So he obviously did continue on. He went
Mhm.
back to Auschwitz, and the rest, as they say, is.
Yeah.
Um, so,
When you were saying it was relevant, it's incredibly relevant. And what I think Glazer has done is show us that it is all of us who can choose to be complacent and complicit in the evil. And it's about the danger of making choices that seem to be, I'm just helping my family survive. I'm just making sure we have enough food to eat. I'm just making sure that we are going to have, my kids will be educated. And in making those choices, you are harming someone else, or you're creating a system. You're creating a system of exclusion, oppression, crimes, right? I mean, we can think about this a lot with, where, whether we drive, what kind of car we drive, the things that we say, the things that we do in our lives, where we choose to live, lots of things, okay, are about compromises. I have kids, one going into college and one just starting college. And I'm always talking about these choices. Okay, you have these choices. You have to make compromises, but you have choices, right?
absolutely.
And I think that what he's showing is that you can become a part of a world where your choices lead to the worst mass murder you can imagine without you even really understanding it. And I lost my train of thought for a second, but
Okay.
um, the idea that he created for his family an illusion of sorts where they didn't see what was going on, but we could always hear it, where they felt okay being complicit or being complacent or ignoring in their mundane lives, ignoring the vast number of people being tortured and killed.
Yeah.
Um, it's that building up of a narrative that family does, right? That I feel is connected to our society. We build up this idea of reality or what the truth is, and that's what we live in. You know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you
And
mean.
all of the messages that maybe something is going wrong or maybe we're contributing to something that's going wrong, we ignore because we become numb to it.
Yeah. You said complicit, complacent. Another word that starts with the COM that it kept coming back to me was compartmentalization. And then
Oh,
how
yeah.
people are able to compartmentalize, especially his wife and to a lesser degree his kids, maybe his older son. His older son definitely understood something that was going on. And we know that because when they were playing their little game and Klaus locks Hans in the greenhouse
Yep.
and makes little hissing gas noises as
Yep.
he's locked in there is also
Oh,
terrifying. But
that gave me a shiver.
um, yeah, I think anytime people are able to, I mean, maybe there's instances where it's good to compartmentalize, but really to not have every part of your life connect to other parts of your lives and not live in total reality can be a dangerous thing, you know. Not
Absolutely.
always, but especially in this case.
I think that's what this film is about.
And maybe, the whole setting of the yard and the garden and the beautiful backyard is a metaphor for the entire country of Germany during this. When people, if we don't find out or if we don't know or we don't see it, it's not real.
Absolutely.
Um, and most of them, didn't hear it. Maybe they saw trains go by or they
Right.
just chalked it up to, well, they're just prisoners, they're
Right.
not doing it. And I think to a certain extent, that's what a lot of them thought. Nobody knew to the extent, the
Hmm.
extermination camps,
Right.
crematoriums.
Right.
Um,
Right. But then you have that was beautiful. Like what you just said that's exactly right. That is what Glazer shows and makes us feel. And then you have these little elements. You brought up the ashes in the garden and how the garden is made from oppressing these other people, right? So
right.
it's the perfect analogy. And then you have the mother-in-law come hanging out by the pool and she
Yeah.
starts coughing,
Yep.
ashes in these constant little reminders of how the suffering of others.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. She seems fairly complicit too, the mother in law.
Yeah.
Well, how could you let a Jew in the house? Hedwig said, they're not
Mhm.
Jewish, they're local girls, but
Mhm.
even to a certain point, where the mother wakes up in the middle of the night and sees the fiery,
Yes.
pall coming out of the chimney, I think is what pushes her over the edge,
Mm.
because I don't think she knew that, well, no, they're murdering and, exterminating these bodies, I think maybe she thought what most people thought, well, they're in camps or we're keeping them in control in these camps, but we're not murdering people. We're not, committing genocide.
That piece I want to go back to watch. What different scenes and things that she hears makes the mother-in-law leave? And why does Glazer decide that she's going to leave in that way? It could have been an argument. They could have had an argument. She could have expressed something to the family. There's so many different ways that you can show this woman leaving this house,
Is
right?
she afraid that they wouldn't let her leave?
Maybe.
Okay, she knows more than we really wanted her to know. You
Yes.
can't leave.
And yet we understand why she leaves to a certain extent,
Mhm,
even if she is a bit complicit.
mhm.
we can see how she's a product of that
Right.
culture, of that what she's being told.
Yeah, she definitely harbors hatred or ill will
Yes.
towards Jewish people.
Right.
I choose not to hate anybody. I think it's too much baggage and stress, but we can hate things or hate people and still not wish death upon them. And
Mhm.
maybe that's where she was at. I
Mhm.
hate them, but I don't, not to that degree. They
Mhm.
don't deserve to not live.
Mhm.
Um, so I guess in order to pivot, I'm glad you love Zones of Interest. I'm sure
Yeah.
you'll watch it again sometime. Um, what to take from it, I guess. We take from it what we will. I think maybe from what Jonathan Glazer said, his father didn't want him to make the film. Glazer, he's Jewish himself.
Yeah.
His dad said, let it rot, leave it in the past. And Jonathan Glazer said, it's not just about the past, it's about now.
Absolutely.
It always will be about now, until things like this never happen again. And as we know, things similar to this have happened since and are happening now.
Yep. Absolutely.
Maybe they're not as publicized, but, tragedies still happen every day. And we go on with our lives and play our games and go to
Mhm.
our films and sporting events while
Yep.
people suffer. So
Yep.
to what degree are
Absolutely.
we all complicit if we
Exactly.
don't stand up and
Excellent.
say something or at the very least acknowledge films like this,
Right.
a film like Zone of Interest, which to end it, maybe to try to goad people into seeing it, is a film which yesterday I read Steven Spielberg said it's the best film about the Holocaust since Schindler's List. So he gives a nod to Glazer while patting himself on the back a little bit, but I would agree that's a mighty fine film
Yes.
in its own right and one that really I'll carry on a little more. I saw Schindler's List when it came out in the theaters when I was probably 14 or 15.
Wow.
It's one of my favorite movies, and even at that young age, I'm 46 now, or I will be on Wednesday.
Happy
It
birthday.
thank you. It's it still sticks with me. I
Yeah.
still watch it once a year, maybe.
Wow.
I
That's
love it,
great.
and much different where it does definitely shows atrocities. It doesn't humanize Nazis
Mhm.
really in any way whatsoever, but both important films, both
Yeah.
films that I hope people watch, films that I think people need to watch, even young people. In a lot of
Absolutely.
ways, I feel like Zones of Interest, while it's pretty heavy subject matter, it's not so vile or explicit in violence or atrocities that younger people couldn't watch it.
I agree. I
You
agree.
think? I mean, yeah, maybe there's an age limit, but I think once you're a teenager, it would probably be okay.
I think so. The one of the first things that I thought of when I started watching it was, do young, really young people understand what happened, um, so that they really truly understand the horror that is going on behind those walls? Because I think that is what is so riveting and devastating watching. You
Yeah,
really do kind of have to know.
right. And maybe it's a better film for kids to start out with. Don't start with Schindler's List. Here's the cover of the book, The Zones of Interest. What's behind the walls is readily available in archival footage or in films like Schindler's
Mhm.
List. Um, Shoah was a wonderful movie that used no archival footage. It was strictly interviews and
Right.
hidden cameras when they
Mhm.
interviewed some of the Nazi
Yeah.
criminals.
I'm impressed
But
that you've
one
seen
of
it.
I own it. It's one of my favorite films. I have the Criterion collection.
Oh, wow.
I usually only watch it when my gal's not around because it's a little dour for her,
So,
and
so depressing.
especially her being
Awful.
from Germany, she doesn't always. She acknowledges it more than her mother, but I think a lot of people, especially Germans, want to leave that
Mhm.
in the past. You
Yeah.
know, and I think for people who were there and were alive in that era, it's easier. They know they don't need an explanation of why this should never happen again, but for the younger generations, they definitely need to know.
Absolutely.
So, on that note, go watch the Zones of Interest. So we are back with Nicole Heinrichs-Bideau.
Bideau.
She was my art of film teacher this past summer, and she had a very wide variety of films that we were able to select from. And the one that really stood out, not just, at this point, not just from the list of films that you put, but really all films, was Aftersun, directed by Charlotte Wells,
Her
in
first
what is
feature.
surprisingly her first feature. So now we will wait and say, if that's your first feature, what do we get next?
How can you make a second film after this one?
And she hasn't yet, and that film came out in 2022, and we will wait, I guess, to see what she does next. She doesn't have to do anything next, because if that's, I said to my gal, I said, if I only make one movie and it was that good, I wouldn't feel like I need to do it
That's
anymore.
a masterpiece, right?
And I liked it the first time I saw it, and I had realized, actually, by picking that movie to watch in your class, I got about halfway through it and went, I've seen this movie before. But again, it was more background, I guess, for me when I first saw it.
Really?
And when I was tasked by your questions of what to write about, did I watch it more closely,
It requires close
and
watching.
realize what a devastating film it is in some ways, but what a beautiful film it is in other ways. Whether that was the kind of relationship that a child had with their parent, or whether they had the complete opposite, and maybe that's something that they longed for or wished that they had with their parent. What really struck me, or what really resonated, or what I took from it was, and I think I wrote about it in my writing that I did for your class, was how our perception of our parents,
Yes.
when we're kids, we don't really question how mom and dad are doing.
No, of course not.
I don't ever remember asking my parents when I was a child, how's your life? How are you feeling? Are you happy?
That would be very
are
unusual.
you happy,
Yeah.
But, and they're so, at least good parents are so in tune to how their child is feeling. So it's really, all and nothing from the kids, We
Right.
just want to play. We want to be happy.
Yeah.
We want to be, uncluttered with drama and stress. And largely, I think that's what a good parent tries to do to a certain degree,
Shield
not
them.
to, not to clear every obstacle, but to ensure that their child is happy, and not to burden them with, whatever might have been bothering our main character, Callum, which they really don't go into it. We don't know. Was it that he parties too hard, or, we only see his life from the perspective of a father. Outside of that, I guess we see him in moments where Sophie's not with him, or she's asleep, where we kind of get more of a sense where he's more real to his nature and what's going on in his life.
Yeah.
But when they're together, it's this kind of relationship that, I mean, they love each other fiercely. You can tell right from the opening scene, one of the opening scenes, where he's still asleep in bed and she's laying there, and the camera, again, Charlotte Wells, I think, had a tendency for long shots or long takes,
Yeah. long talk, yeah.
Why is the camera staying on Sophie's face for so long? Because she wants us to look at it and acknowledge that she's proud of her dad, even while he's asleep. She stares at him and then smiles before she loves him, to death. And in some ways, I think throughout the film, we get hints that kids are more perceptive than we might think.
Yes.
But they're also resilient, and his pain is not going to allow her to not have fun, and meet new friends at the arcade, or go about the vacation,
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah. Any thoughts on Aftersun?
So many.
So many.
So many. I love how you presented it. and how the relationship between a parent and their children is about shielding them from personal issues that might be negative or feel struggling. Um, and what I loved about this film was its intimacy. And you mentioned how Wells would have these long takes on faces, especially Sophie's face and her. We are attracted to faces. As humans, we could look at a face for so long. That's the one thing that we really love looking at. And when you have a close-up of a face, you're trying to read into it. I mean, that's how we evolved. We're very perceptive and looking, trying to find what the emotion is, communicating, right?
Mhm.
And so when they do it so beautifully. Wells and the cinematographer do this so beautifully. And often when we see Callum, we don't always see his face close up. We see him a lot from behind. We see him in reflections in a lot of the film, especially when he's doing his Tai Chi. We see him in a reflection in a mirror, and he's only maybe half. The composition is very interesting when you look at Callum and how Callum and his daughter are together and how they're separated, and how careful she is about the composition depending on what they're talking about. So a really riveting scene is when Callum, I think he's brushing his teeth or he's taking off he has a cast on his arm, and he's taking it off, and he's on one half of the screen and Sophie's on the other half on the bed. He's in the bathroom, and there's a wall separating them, and they're having this conversation back and forth, and they're literally separated by a wall.
Mhm.
But you can see them both, and they're talking to each other. And so you get to see their reactions, and I don't remember exactly what they were talking about because I haven't seen the film in a little bit.
Well, she was asking him about why do you tell Mom that you love her still? I overheard you on the phone talking to Mom, and I think we get the impression that they're separated. I don't know if
Yes.
they're divorced, but they're separated. But yeah, so that's what they're talking about. She says, why do you tell her that you love her if you're not together? He says, well, you tell Grandma and Grandpa you love them, or you tell your friends you love them.
Yeah.
Because she's family,
Right.
Still love her. It's not in love with her, maybe.
It's so interesting because the choice of having them be so separate and talk about that.
And the colors are different, too.
The colors are different,
Her half
too.
of the screen is, again, yellowish, which you asked us to talk about color in the film.
Yeah, I did.
Yellow is represented throughout the whole film, but his side of the screen or the frame is blue. And a lot of time when Callum is by himself or in his own part, it's dark or it's blue.
Like a bruise.
A bruise, that's what I wrote, yeah.
Uh-huh. That's so great. And she's sort of, and yellow is a color also that's very nostalgic, right? It's happy, but it represents nostalgia with this sort of our cultural idea of weathered photographs that turn sort of yellow, but it's also evocative of sunshine.
Yes.
Right? So that sort of innocence tinged with nostalgia, because in the story, I think one of the things that is the most fascinating, aside from that intimacy that she creates with very few words, is the narrative structure on those three perspectives of the story. So you have the perspective through the camcorder video player, right, from the actual footage, the video footage from that vacation in Turkey when this girl was 11 or 12. And then you have the girl as a woman looking back, and we presume her father has passed. And she's remembering and trying to think of who her father really was, those kinds of things. And then you have the track where we're sort of a little bit more neutral, right? And those have different ways of filming. You can tell where you are, different ways of composition, different colors. And so the narrative is broken up, and this is why I had as a choice for editing, because it really does involve editing, both visual and sound editing. When do you have the sound overlap? like, an L cut or a J cut, and how do you mix the sound when you're going between three different sort of modules of perception, right? You have the camcorder, you have sort of the more neutral, and then you have Sophie looking back.
The adult Sophie. Which
The
I think
adult
with the
Sophie.
camcorder, we're to believe that this is her watching back, or
Oh,
that's what
yes.
she's watching from her
Yes.
living room.
Right. And it's beautiful the way that Charlotte Wells weaves those together to create, again, a kind of emotional landscape of trying to grapple with, trying to understand a person. It's a character study, right? We're trying to understand who Sophie is and who her dad is and what their relationship means.
Right. Yeah.
I love the experimenting part because I think that because there are those three different perspectives, or maybe even more, you automatically start thinking about, again, you bring it to yourself, you walk away with it. I think once it's not this glamorized, sensational entertainment thing, which can be beautiful and amazing to watch, and it can be art for sure, and you love it, it hasn't worked its way into yourself the way some of these smaller films do, where they're avoiding the sensationalism because they're trying to show the intimacy or they're trying to show the struggle or whatever it is. And with the experimental techniques, you come out of the film a little tiny bit and you let that come into you. I mean, at least that's how I do it. It
Yeah.
somehow makes its way into me, so I start reflecting on it as, how is that in my life? Oh, yeah, I think about that too. When I was 11, what did I think about my dad? You
Right.
know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the big things I took from the film. It's one of those films that I've really felt absolved by. It's
Yeah.
just in a different way than the last film we talked about, but it's still heart-wrenching. It's still
Yeah.
devastating in a lot of ways, but um this one is beautiful. To me,
Me too.
it's one of the most beautiful films I've watched. You know, Aftersun will make me cry at least once almost every
Yep.
time I watch
Yes.
through it.
Me too.
Um, um, boy,
Yeah, there's a way that she makes you emotionally involved in that film. I want to go back and see it again.
and you should. Um, and I know that from reading her, I've read a little bit about her talking about it, and it is semi autobiographical. She lost her dad at a young age, and maybe this film was a tribute or a therapeutic for her to go through.
Exploration. Yeah.
She said she doesn't like to chalk it up to it's completely autobiographical because she says, no, there were a lot of, as you say, with editing and that, there was a lot of choices. It wasn't just me saying, this is exactly what happened. This is how we do it. So there was plenty of collaboration and choices, strict choices made, and how to piece this together. But the way that she did it, or I guess her and her editor did it, was remarkable. And
Yeah.
the sound is, very important to the film. Near the end, the last night of their trip, I don't know if you notice, I noticed that during their dance that they had, it was Queen's, I think, Save the Last Dance. It talked about, it gave us an indication that either the trip is coming to an end
Yes.
or
It
their
was
relationship
so
as parent and
suggestive of that.
child is coming to an end.
Yes. That was so suggestive. And that's what I love about the visual. Well, that's what I love about cinema
Mm.
is the choices you make for what you can see, what you hear, how you see it, how you present it, suggest things, just like in the other film we were talking about, right? It's how you film it. You don't have to say. In fact, that's what makes film so brilliant, is you experience it and you understand without being told
Yeah.
what's happening.
Or you understand without being able to necessarily tell why it
Right.
affects you so much.
The editor was Blair McClendon. I wanted to
Okay.
mention that because I thought the editing
Oh,
was
they
just
deserve a note for sure.
amazing, really incredible. This sort of that fragmented, the editing was so like in the zone of interest, it matched part of the theme, that fragmented nature of memory. And it was fragmented in a way from these different perspectives that felt like that. It felt like you were trying to recollect in the recesses of your mind. What was that like? Oh, look, here's a photograph. Oh, I forgot about it like that. That's not the way I thought of it. It's so that the way it was edited felt like the way you think about things, like your memory, with the way your memory recreates reality.
Right. Absolutely. Well, when I got into film class, I wasn't sure which angle I wanted to go in when I started with Mike Eddy last year.
Yeah.
As we started learning, I thought that editing was my favorite. I loved it. I loved taking that kind of raw piece of clay and molding it and making it look pretty. This year, we've went into more sound design and audio class, and I thought, well, maybe that's what I want to do because I love that too, and I've always been a music guy. Either way, both of these aspects of filmmaking, editing, and sound design play heavily into both of these movies that we've watched today.
Absolutely.
So, well, I guess I thought that the subject was a little maudlin and not very conducive to a great conversation about film. I will correct myself and say that it's been an absolute pleasure, even though
Yes,
the
me too.
material was difficult and hard sometimes to face, be it genocide or mental health.
But like you said, we need to be confronted with these things. We need
Yes.
to be thinking about them.
Absolutely.
It's part of our lives.
Yes, it's maybe art imitating life or vice versa. Either way, film can be a very powerful conduit for that. Well, I'd love to have you back some other time. We can
Yes.
talk about Aftersun for like 2 more
I
hours.
know.
And
You're going to be an amazing editor or sound
Oh,
editor.
thank you.
Incredible.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'd just like to thank you, Nicole, for being so gracious as to watch the film that
Yes. Oh, I'm so
I
glad.
tasked you to watch this
Thank you
time.
for doing that.
Tasked me to watch many great
You
films.
gave me an
I'm
amazing
so
assignment.
glad you enjoyed it, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
I would love it.
Who knows? It's always fun to
I would love
discuss
it,
film
Brad.
and to know how other people take it and perceive it and digest it.
Yeah.
But for now, that is the end of our inaugural episode of Big Little Pictures. I'd like to thank Nicole and
Thank
all
you.
of you listeners. Have a great day. See you next time. What a pleasure it was to have Nicole Heinrichs-Bideau with me today. Her knowledge of film and ability to analyze and interpret what's on the screen is very insightful and definitely gave me yet another great viewpoint on the 2 films that we discussed. It was so much fun for me to share this talk with you today. Please check out our next episode where we'll be traveling back to 1984 to revisit the debut film from Joel and Ethan Coen, Blood Simple. Our guests will be fellow film students of mine, Liam Spillane and Palnika Kay, so be sure to tune in. We'll see you next time on Big Little Pictures.